Yeah, I got interested in my field kind of indirectly. I actually studied urban planning when I was an undergrad, but because of that, I ended up working on a project about a wildland-urban interface fire that happened in the community where I was going to school. And because of that, I started sort of looking at spatial interactions between urban development and wildlands and how that relates to fire risk. And through that work, I ended up transitioning all the way to really just being passionate and interested in the fire side of things and not so much in the urban side of things. So now what I really love doing is studying plants and forests and how they respond to fire, but also working with fire managers. So it's been a bit of a long-term shift, but the common themes were sort of fire and spatial studies, and I really like what I do now.
So I guess I first got interested in ecology just because I love being outside, and I, as an undergrad, was like, what classes can I take and be outside all the time? And they were ecology labs. And then once I started studying it, I got really excited about ecology itself and some of the questions you could ask. And in terms of fire, I really started getting interested in fire after undergrad. I worked for the UC Berkeley Fire Lab, and we lived in Tahoe National Forest, and we're doing all this work out in this landscape. And I started really learning about fire, and I just found it really fascinating, and so been trying to study aspects of fire since then. So my dissertation kind of veered into invasive plants and how they interact with fire, and now I'm back kind of in more just post-fire landscapes and climate change.
Yeah, so I would say my reasons for how I got into ecology and forest ecology are sort of similar. It was a love for the outdoors, and I grew up in this little town in northern New Mexico on the edge of the Jemez Mountains, and I actually vividly remember this really large forest fire that occurred in 1977. It was one of the first really big high-severity fires in ponderosa pine, and so kind of what got me really hooked on fire ecology was growing up in that landscape. I spent a lot of time sort of seeing succession happen and hiking around in that area that burned, and always really was drawn to it.
What I'm really interested in these days is sort of interactions between burn severity and fire history. But yeah, I'm especially interested in how fire frequency in this like very infrequent fire regime interacts with burn severity, since we are starting to see these overlapping fires, which we didn't expect to see that happening at this frequency in the past. And it seems like there's an additive effect there. So I'm interested in how that shows up spatially and what causes those interactions, but also then what are the outcomes ecologically for understory plants, but also for big sort of charismatic trees as well.
So what I'm really excited about and working on these days is trying to figure out how fire will catalyze these changes that we expect due to climate change. So we expect species ranges to shift with changing climate, but trees, for example, live for a really long time, and so it would be a slow process for these trees to kind of move across the landscape, whereas fires can come and kill adult trees and really speed up this process. And so trying to figure out where we will expect to see these shifts, and then also what other factors will be important in determining whether or not we're seeing shifts in vegetation with climate change.
Yeah, I would say, what is the capacity for fire and other disturbances to catalyze regime shifts or fundamental transformations in the ecosystems that we value, and how that fits in with the trajectories of climate change that we expect, and then what do we do about this?
But I also just very recently defended my PhD thesis about a month ago, and some of the most rewarding experiences I've had with that have been moments where, you know, I collected all this data and I did an analysis, and I sort of sit down afterwards and I'm like, we know this is true. We showed this. Like, that is so cool. So I love moments like that where I'm like doing statistics, which can sound really boring, but then you definitively show something that's so exciting to me.
Similarly, I also get really excited about about statistics. So mainly I would say is that like this project, I spent like 3 years doing all of this field work and counting so many tree rings. And I love doing field work. It's definitely my favorite things to do. And to see all these different landscapes that had experienced fire was really amazing. But then when you finally have all this data and to like run this model and see that you do have a pattern and you do have results and it makes sense of what you are seeing on the landscape was really exciting. And I love that part of science. And then what I really love, and it's been great at this conference in particular, is like the collaboration and like meeting with other people who are equally excited about some of the same things that I'm excited about, like all of the same scientific questions that you have as well.
So there's all these kind of built-in rewards, but fundamentally, I would say it's the process, it's the feel, it's being out and seeing, having these really great experiences in the field, as they already said. It's that moment when you're like, it's like the scientific discovery or the insights that you're like, I think of it this way, like. You can go walk around and just see these beautiful forests or these beautiful landscapes. Maybe they're totally burned and they're still really beautiful landscapes. But when you really probe in there and take the scientific approach, it's like, oh, I'm starting to see these things that are like, I didn't see, but now I see them. And I think that's fundamentally the most rewarding part. But I'll also second this. It's super fun to come and geek out with a bunch of people and like who also like to sit around and have beers until late at night talking about like their favorite thing that they like to think about. So yeah, that's really rewarding too.
Hi guys, I'm Zoe Shapira. I'm a master's student here in the Forest and Rangeland Stewardship Department. I study forest recovery after disturbances in Central Rockies. So for our talk today, we're actually going to have 3 speakers doing quick 15-minute flash talks on fire ecology. And it's going to be structured across latitudes, so we're going to start in the north. Our first speaker is Dr. Ellen Whitman, visiting us from Alberta, Canada. Dr. Whitman is a PhD candidate at the University of Alberta and a fire research assistant with the Canadian Forest Service. Here she studies the spatial and temporal distribution and effects of fire and burn severity on Canadian boreal forests. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ellen Whitman.
Thanks. Yeah, hi, thanks for having me. I guess to clarify, I am a doctor and no longer a candidate. So I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Marc-André Parisien, Dan Thompson, and Mike Flanagan. They had a big role in this work as well. And this is some of my dissertation research about drought and wildfire in the boreal forest. I always start with a lot of context about the boreal when I'm outside of that ecosystem because it is pretty different and pretty special. Shown here on the map, the extent of the boreal forest in green. Alaska's a bit cut off, sorry, but that's because my work is focused in sort of the central Western Canadian boreal forest. The boreal forest is a really important biome because it contains about 1/3 of the Earth's forests and 14% of total land cover. So it's globally important for the reason of its size and extent alone, but it also plays a really important role in carbon cycling and in water and ecosystem services, which I think is apparent from this map. And my research focuses in this area around Great Slave Lake, which is the large water body in the center of the square there, in the Northwest Territories and northern Alberta. This ecosystem is pretty much conifer dominated and is really characterized by species like black spruce, jack pine, and white spruce. But there is also a broadleaf component. Hopefully you can see sort of some differences there in the shape of the crowns in the photo as well. And these are species like trembling aspen, balsam poplar, and paper birch. But generally their secondary and most stands are dominated by conifers. But there is quite highly variable land cover in this ecosystem, not due to topography. My work is done in the boreal plain, which is really flat, but the hydrology of this area is quite variable and leads to landscapes like this one that have really short gradients in changes in land cover due to the hydrology. So uplands and wetlands in this ecosystem tend to have sort of different trajectories, but wetlands are really, really important in the boreal forest. In my study area, they're up to 50% of the land cover, which is a pretty big component, but they're also buggy and soggy, and people tend not to do research in them. But they often are forested in this ecosystem. So it's important to get into those sites as well. And when the weather conditions are right, both wetlands like these ones and uplands do burn in this ecosystem quite readily. Fires are the most extensive and severe disturbance in terms of habitat change and tree mortality in the boreal zone. And the fire regime of the northwestern Canadian boreal forest is characterized by large, lethal, stand-replacing crown fires like the one shown in the photo. And I want to be really clear, this is an ecosystem where this type of fire is actually typical. It's what is expected and what the species are adapted to. There is a mix of burn severities in these fires, but this is not a sort of an uncharacteristic change from reference conditions, for example. So despite those really severe fires, boreal plant species have characteristics that allow them to respond to fire and really readily reestablish afterwards. So for example, serotiny and cones that open after heating and then release viable seeds from an aerial seed bank, like the lovely little jack pine cone in the photo. There are also species that resprout or sucker from roots and rhizomes of top-killed individuals like trembling aspens. And there's also seed banking either in aerial seed banks or in the soils as well. So these adaptations and characteristics together provide in situ seed and propagule sources that allow these stands to recover to a really similar composition to what was there before through direct regeneration or stand self-replacement. And this is something that is especially associated with northern forests. It's not necessarily something that we talk about a successional trajectory over time, but it's really quite a resilient response in that you have an ecosystem in one state that experiences a severe disturbance, and it typically is expected to recover to a really similar condition in terms of both structure and composition afterward. And also, because of this really rapid response from resprouting and from serotiny and so on, we tend to see that the pattern of seedling establishment and that the composition is established really shortly after fire in the north. So within approximately 10 years, over 50% of all seedlings have already established and been recruited. So you can actually tell in pretty short order whether the ecosystem is going to resemble what it used to be before. Just a little sort of backing up and talking about fire and fuels. Once an area has burned severely, like in those fires that I showed, it's unsurprisingly fuel limited. So you need revegetation and decomposition over several years before a young forest can really become susceptible to fire again. And in the boreal forest, from various studies, we've sort of suggested that there's a window of about 30 to 50 years where these sites resist reburning, or rather they're so fuel limited that they're less likely to burn than the rest of the landscape. But under extreme weather conditions, this control can be overridden. So this is an example from Wood Buffalo National Park, which is a really large protected area in my study zone. And what's shown here is the resistance to reburning as a function of time. So each, as a line approaches 1, the burned area is equally likely to burn as the rest of the landscape. So under sort of extreme 90th percentile drought conditions, it's resisting reburning for a shorter amount of time, maybe 20, 25 years, versus up to and above 35 years under more wet conditions. So because we have this resistance to reburning, we're sort of interested in whether there could be a change in the resilient responses expected in this ecosystem if we experience a shift in terms of the frequency of disturbance from both drought and fire in this ecosystem. So specifically, I was trying to look at whether boreal forest resilience to increasing rates of disturbance from fire frequency and post-fire drought was going to be sort of carrying forward over time if those conditions were to change. To look at this, I used a paired study design, and each pair was made up of 2 sites, unsurprisingly, one with a long fire-free interval, which I defined as greater than or equal to 30 years between fires, which may not seem that long to some people. A more typical fire return interval is over 90 to 100 years in this ecosystem, but that's reflecting that fuel accumulation rather than like an expected return interval. And a short pair member with a short fire-free interval of less than or equal to 17 years, which again, that may seem not that short to some people who are familiar with ecosystems that experience frequent surface fire, but that's an extremely short fire return interval for this ecosystem. So we have one pair member that was burning at a long interval and one that's been matched with a short interval. And these 2 sites burned in the same most recent fire and were the same ecosite type before that fire. So they've been recovering from that fire for the same amount of time and under the same climatological conditions. So sites were distributed across quite a broad range of fires there and all around Great Slave Lake. But to give you a sort of more visual idea of what that looks like, we can focus on pair number 9, which burned originally in 1998 and then burned again in 2004 at the short interval site, whereas the long interval pair member, shown with a square, burned in 2004, and then prior to that it would have burned in some fire before we were bothering to map fire in the far north in Canada. And because I have this range of different fire years that I was looking at, although the two pairs, or the two members of the pair, have had the same climatological conditions after fire, there's a difference in a variety there across the different fire years in what post-fire conditions and climates were. So in 2016, I sampled burn severity or fire effects post-fire at these sites, understory vegetation communities, tree, seedling, and sucker density and composition. And I also wanted to look at post-fire drought. So to do that, I used cumulative site-level anomalies in climatic moisture deficit from the year of fire up until 4 years afterwards. And this was to represent moisture stress. Climatic moisture deficit is essentially actual precipitation minus potential evapotranspiration. So it's not an actual soil moisture measure, it's rather sort of a moisture availability measure. And finally, to confirm those fire-free intervals that were so key to the study design and also the amount of time that these sites had been recovering from fire, I used dendrochronological methods with fire-scarred trees from each site. So on the left, we have we have a long interval pair member, and on the right, a short interval pair member, and I think it's apparent we saw really, really obvious and significant differences between the short and long interval sites immediately after fire in terms of the fire effects. And that showed up in the results in the data as well. Just to explain these plots quickly, because the pair members are the same age, they've been linked with a line connecting them, so you can sort of see the direction of the effect of the difference between these two sites that are of the same age and same ecosite type. So, and also there's an asterisk in the heading if the difference is significant. So generally speaking, the short interval sites had substantially more exposed mineral soil and rock remaining after fire, and that was surprisingly persistent over time, but this was only really significant in uplands. However, there was a reduction in the organic soil layer depth in both uplands and wetlands. And finally, we also see sort of a reduced post-fire overstory canopy density as well at these sites, meaning that there's been some tree mortality, things have opened up, there's greater light availability as well. But interestingly, those effects that we saw are sort of persistent over time. So this is, again, a long and short interval pair member, but we're sort of thinking more about the understory vegetation community here. And these are sites that have been recovering from fire for 12 years. So it really does look like there's a sort of a persistent change. You can still see exposed mineral soil at the short interval site. There's not much going on there in terms of the understory vegetation community. There's a couple seedlings and so on, some sort of crusty moss and not a lot else. And again, that shows up in the data. So this trend is a little bit less obvious, but using, again, those paired statistical tests, so I sort of should have mentioned that better, but we used paired t-test if the data was normal, or paired Wilcoxon signed rank tests if it was not normally distributed. And again, we have this reduction in the percent cover of herbaceous vegetation. And that seems to have translated as well to sort of a loss of species richness. So the plot on the right is showing alpha diversity as represented by hill numbers of affected species, if you're familiar with that. So this is not the actual species richness at these sites, but rather if you had equally abundant species and you were trying to sort of reconstruct the same diversity measure, this is what it would be. And in our short interval sites, especially in uplands, we're seeing sort of a reduction of about 1 effective species. So that's not a big change really, but because hill numbers are scalable, it's closer to maybe almost a 10% decline in diversity. So it seems to be kind of meaningful as well. And finally, getting into the fun stuff with the trees. Again, you can see these differences between the short and long interval sites. On the left, there's dead, mature jack pines that have a nice, beautiful understory of jack pine seedlings that have recruited pretty much immediately after the fire. Whereas on the right, there were, prior to this, jack pine saplings that have then been killed in the most recent fire, and you don't see a lot of conifer recruitment there. And this shows up in the statistical test. So the real big change that we see in these sites is a substantial reduction in stem density of conifers due to the reduction in recruitment there. And that is essentially due to the loss of the seeds and the seed propagal sources rather than for example, a change in the climate. And we see no change, interestingly, in broadleaf density, which kind of makes sense if you think about what their seed sources are. They're sort of able to disperse more broadly on the landscape. Because conifers are the most important contributor of stems in this ecosystem, however, it does lead to a total reduction in stem density and a shift in the proportion of conifer stems towards this more broadleaf-dominated forest. So we see a quite substantial and presumably persistent change because these effects that are determined really shortly after fire in this ecosystem carry forward. So we're seeing a shift from a conifer-dominated ecosystem into one that's more like an open broadleaf woodland or grassland in some cases. And finally, to try and explain what was happening in these sites, we fit generalized linear models. But I'm not going to go into too much detail about them because it's kind of boring. But instead, we'll look at some marginal effect plots that describe better what's going on there. So of course, unsurprisingly, fire-free interval, as it increases, it also increased the total stem density at these sites. That's not that surprising. It fits with what we saw in our field data. But fire-free interval was by far and away the most important driver of these shifts as well. But interestingly, it also interacted with climate. So in this example, we have our moisture stress variable where wet post-fire conditions are on the left, dry post-fire conditions are on the right. And we have the same differences where we have short fire-free intervals being negative for conifer stem density. But if you have that same already negative short fire-free interval in a drought condition after fire, you're dropping way, way down even further in that stem density. Again, in terms of the proportion of conifers in the post-fire cohort, fire-free interval has the same effect, but we got this interaction with moisture stress again, where seed beds are being less useful for conifer establishment in dry years as they are relative to wet years. So generally speaking, I think we can sort of conclude from this that climate change is going to accelerate and reinforce ongoing changes in species composition in these ecosystems because we're already seeing sort of a shift north of these climates that are favorable for broadleaf species, and yet this disturbance is reinforcing that same shift. And there's sort of this interacting effect of drought and frequency that further yet again reinforces that and opens up these forests even more. And we're starting to see this conversion of boreal forests to sort of open woodlands and grasslands, which is a pretty big change for this ecosystem that is globally quite vast and quite important for carbon and habitat. So thanks for your time. I think I spoke a little longer than I meant to, but there might be some time for questions. Thanks.
Is Dr. Kim Davis, who is a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Montana in the Northern Rockies, where she works in the paleoecology and fire ecology lab, as well as the forest landscape ecology lab. Dr. Davis focuses on post-fire tree regeneration in low elevation forests in the western United States, as well as these ecosystems' resilience to climate change. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kim Davis.
Thanks, and thanks, Camille, for inviting us to speak today. It's fun to be here. So yeah, I'm going to talk about a totally different forest type, low elevation forests. You all are probably very familiar with these ponderosa pine, Douglas fir forests, where we see the transition from grasslands or shrublands into the forest. And what we've been seeing in these forest types across much of the western US is increasingly a failure of trees to regenerate following fire. So Camille has done some work, Jonathan, who's also going to talk, has also done some work, but there's also been studies in California. So in various areas, people are observing that they go to these fires in areas where there used to be resilience, there used to be trees coming back after fire, and they're not seeing trees coming back. And this is just another example of that. Even in Montana, where I live, so a relatively cooler and wetter area, this is a fire that occurred 17 years before this photo was taken, and you really don't see much recruitment at all. And in fact, we had a plot up here, and we didn't see any trees in that plot. And so what my research focuses on is trying to figure out why aren't we seeing this recruitment. And there has been work showing that seed source is really important, which is true. But what I'm interested in focusing on is what's the role of climate conditions. And the reason that I'm so focused on climate is because adult and juvenile tree species have different climate niches, or they have different climate conditions that they can tolerate. So we can think of adults, which have these really long, deep roots that go to deeper soil water. They have thick bark. They're much less sensitive to drought and also to really hot temperatures than seedlings. So that's what's represented here, with juveniles having a smaller niche. So adults can exist in these climate spaces that aren't suitable for regeneration because trees are so long-lived. So maybe when the trees that are living out here regenerated, the climate was different, it was cooler and wetter, and now they're persisting in this landscape where it's no longer suitable for regeneration. So if we have a fire in these areas where climate is no longer suitable for regeneration, we might expect, if it's a high severity fire that kills the adult trees, we might expect a shift to maybe a non-forest state or a totally different type of vegetation. But to really understand if this is what's happening and this is the reason that we've been seeing these recruitment failures, we need to identify and quantify the actual climate conditions that are necessary for regeneration. So that was our first main goal for ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, and doing this at the annual scale. So what were the climate conditions like in the years that trees were establishing following fire, not what's the average 30-year site climate. And then once we could identify these relationships, we were interested in how has the climate suitability for regeneration changed over time. So to get at this problem, what we wanted to do was collect a bunch of trees that had established following fires across the West, and then age them so that we could see what were the climate conditions like in the years when these trees established. And so we went to fires in 4 main regions, so the Northern Rockies, the Front Range of Colorado, the Southwest Mountains, and then Northern California. And at each one of those sites, we had 90 sites overall, we set up a transect in a fire that had occurred between 1988 and 2007. And then we destructively sampled all of the tree seedlings. So you can see we dug up all the trees, we packed them up in the back of the car, and then we went on this massive road trip and brought them back to the lab. So this was great. We went on like a 5,000-mile road trip, which was really fun to see all these different forests. But once we got back to the lab, then we had all these trees, and we really had a lot of work to do because we wanted to have annual precision dates. So there's ways to estimate the age of a tree seedling in the field by counting the branch whorls or the bud scars, but those don't give you the exact year that the tree established because there's a little bit of error around them. So to get the real exact year that these trees started growing, what we had to do was take each one of our samples and cut it up into segments across this root-shoot boundary. And then we sanded each one of these segments and we aged all of them. These are 4 different trees. They're not all from one tree. And by doing this, what we could do is find the exact year or the oldest segment where pith first appeared. And that was the year that that tree started growing. We did this for almost 3,000 trees, approximately half ponderosa pine and half Douglas fir. So you can imagine this took a really long time. There's a lot of time at the microscope. But it was worth it because we got these age structures for every one of our sites. So this is just an example from one site, actually from the Hayman fire, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. And what we saw was that we had recruitment in some years, and we didn't have any recruitment in other years. And so we wanted to figure out what was causing this variability. And so we did this using boosted regression trees, which is a machine learning technique. And we had a binomial response. So if we had recruitment that was above some very minimal threshold that varied by region, just to account for the lower density of forests in the Southwest versus the Northern Rockies, we called that a presence. And then in years where we were below that threshold, we called that an absence. And we modeled this binomial response as a function of seasonal climate predictors. So the first one was vapor pressure deficit. This is a measure of how dry the atmosphere is. So how much is the atmosphere pulling water out of these seedlings? We also used maximum surface temperature, which is really important because seedlings are very sensitive to hot temperatures, and hot temperatures can actually girdle seedlings and cause them to die. And then we used soil moisture of the driest month and spring soil moisture because, again, these seedlings have really short roots, so they're very sensitive to soil moisture. We also included other variables like time since fire, distance to seed source, and fire severity because we know that these also matter a lot for post-fire regeneration. When we look at our results, what we found was that we had these very nonlinear responses in relationships between annual recruitment, probability, and our climate variables. So here what we're showing is a partial dependency plot. So it's the effect of this variable on the x-axis after accounting for the average effects of all the other variables in the model. And what we have on the y is the recruitment probability. So over here it's cooler and wetter than average, and once we cross some threshold, we see this rapid decline in recruitment probability. And so we saw that for both climate variables that were important for ponderosa pine, which were summer vapor pressure deficit and the soil moisture of the driest month. So once again, once we crossed some sort of threshold, we have more soil moisture, we saw a large increase in the recruitment probability. We saw similar trends for Douglas fir. However, different climate variables turned out to be more important for Douglas fir. So maximum surface temperature, once we cross about 49 degrees Celsius any day during the summer, that caused a big decline in the recruitment probability. And then again, with soil moisture, it's slightly less of a threshold effect, but it's still, once we cross this value, we do see a jump in recruitment probability. So once we identified these thresholds, we were really interested in comparing these thresholds to the climate conditions that our sites had experienced over the past 35 years, or the record of our climate data. And so that's what I'm showing here. What we have here is this, again, this threshold that we identified, which is shown here. Each one of these lines is the mean for each site within each of those regions. So California, Colorado, the Northern Rockies, and the Southwest. And every time one of these lines drops below this threshold, which means the climate conditions are suitable for regeneration, I put a dot down here. So you can see that before 2000, there's a lot of dots. There's plenty of years that have climate conditions that are suitable for regeneration. After about 2000, we see this really rapid decline. There aren't very many years that have good climate conditions in terms of vapor pressure deficit for regeneration. For Douglas fir, we saw a similar, although less strong pattern. It's not quite as clear-cut as it was for ponderosa pine. This is an example with maximum surface temperature where, especially in the Northern Rockies, we see this increasing trend, which results in fewer years that cross below that threshold, and thus we would expect a declining recruitment probability in these years. So what I just showed you were the time series for only one of the climate variables, but both of these species had two climate variables that were explaining their recruitment probability overall. So to look at the combined effect of these variables, we used our models to predict recruitment probability from 1980 to 2015 while keeping time since fire, distance to seed source, and fire severity constant. So really what this line is a measure of climate suitability. So when it's up here, it means it's a really good year for seedlings to recruit, and when it's down here, it means it's really a tough climate conditions for seedlings to get established. And again, what you see is a lot of variability, which is expected. Ponderosa pine tends to have really episodic recruitment, and it's partially explained by climate, partially by cone production. But here we see a lot of variability, but potential years with good climate conditions. However, again, right after about 2000, the climate conditions become much less suitable, and we less frequently have these good years for recruitment. You'll notice here in Colorado, there's actually more variability than in some of the other regions, and that's because we had this increase in the variability of vapor pressure deficit. So even though it's getting drier, there's also more variability, so we're still seeing a couple years that are good for recruitment. Douglas fir, again, the patterns were not quite as clear-cut as they were for ponderosa pine. Overall, we see in the Northern Rockies the biggest decline. Statistically, in the Southwest, there was a decline, but that's not, it's not quite as strong as in the Northern Rockies. And in California, we didn't see any pattern at all. And that's because there's a lot of variability in the spring soil moisture in California. So what these plots are allowing us to do is really link climate change to these recruitment failures that we've seen in recent years. So this is really showing a mechanism that could be explaining some of these areas where we're not seeing recruitment. It could be because the climate is really not suitable for regeneration anymore. I should say we targeted this at the hottest and driest sites where we could find ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. So this is not applicable to everywhere that we have ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. It's really the hottest and the driest areas. Although annual climate was important, other variables in our model were also important. So what this is showing is the relative influence of each of these different variables in the ponderosa pine and Douglas fir model. And so you can see this green is the distance to the seed source. So for ponderosa pine, which has bigger seeds, they don't disperse as far. That's still a really important driver of post-fire regeneration, as well as fire severity, which is shown in this dark blue. And then finally, one last point that I wanted to raise was that we think about climate change affecting whether or not these trees are recruiting, but there's also really small scale changes in climate, like in microclimate, that can affect whether or not we see trees regenerating. So some work that we've done has shown that the canopy cover can buffer the temperatures in the understory by, on average, 5 degrees Celsius. And then last summer, we put out temperature sensors in a fire that had happened the year before in 2017 in Montana. And what you'll see in these unburned areas, the temperatures at the surface where these seedlings are growing are 5 to 10 degrees cooler in the hottest part of the growing season. So this is July and August. And so just by removing the canopy through a fire, we might be able to push sites beyond this threshold of maximum surface temperature. So the difference between an unburned or a low severity area and a high severity area can also have a lot of impact on whether or not we see trees regenerating. So overall, what we found were the very strongly nonlinear relationships between tree recruitment and annual climate conditions. And when we looked at our sites, we found that many of our sites had, in fact, already crossed many of these thresholds. So what this means is that where these forests have crossed these thresholds, so the hottest and driest sites where ponderosa pine and Douglas fir are, we might expect that if a fire comes through that kills the mature individuals, we could see a conversion to some grassland or shrubland, or in some areas we saw oak, but just a different forest state because we won't expect to see regeneration of ponderosa pine or Douglas fir. So with that, thanks to all the field help and my funding sources.
Keep the questions to the end still? Okay, great. So our final speaker is Dr. Jonathan Coop, an associate professor of biology and environment and sustainability at Western Colorado University in Gunnison. Dr. Coop's research focuses on post-fire recovery and state transitions in forest ecosystems of the southern Rocky Mountains, as well as forest management for enhanced resilience in the context of climate change. So let's welcome Jonathan Coop.
Thanks. Okay, so I was gonna just present the presentation that I gave this week at the meetings, which we were all at, but since I knew so I was either gonna do a 12-minute presentation in 20 minutes or something else. So I'm trying to smoosh together 2 different talks here, and I'll probably run out of time. But thanks, Camille, for inviting us over. As was mentioned, I'm coming over from Gunnison, Colorado. And so it's really nice to come. It's been a really long, cold winter over there, so it's great to come over here and enjoy this beautiful, sunny spring weather like we've had the last couple of days. I've really been enjoying that quite a bit. I was almost about to put my flip-flops on today, but all right. So let's get started. As you guys are undoubtedly aware, in our last 2 speakers and some great work that Camille has done are demonstrating, we are seeing, it's unequivocal. We're seeing warmer and drier conditions across Western North America. These are altering our fire regimes, leading to more fire, more high severity fire, so basically more things that kill trees, and these are also leading to decreased rates of forest recovery because it's harder to be a tree seedling in a hotter and drier world. So we can kind of think about this broadly, like what happens when you when you burn a forest down? And this is just a really kind of silly conceptual graphic showing that basically, we can imagine here's our disturbance event, a fire, let's say. Here's sort of some metric of how different the area is pre and post this disturbance. We can imagine these different trajectories. So here's like this resistance, like, hey, this area really was essentially unimpacted. It was not strongly affected. Then we can imagine sort of these other trajectories where, hey, this area was impacted, but then it kind of recovered to that pre-disturbance state. That's what we would consider to be resilience, right? And then we sort of have this other thing where it was impacted and it just became something totally different. And I think that's really what we're primarily concerned with in these systems that we're seeing these changes take place. But there are also these other trajectories. I'm calling them sort of delayed resilience. So maybe in 1,000 years the forest will come back. One problem is our view of contemporary changes is limited by short time frames. So we're going into these areas, 10 years post-fire, 20 years post-fire, even 50 years post-fire. And so you could sort of imagine that really we're seeing these changes, but we don't necessarily know exactly where we are. And I'm going to make the case that we can just call this zone up here type conversion. It's different. It's not a forest. Maybe it'll be a forest again in 100 or 1,000 years. But in the meantime, it's not a forest, and we're going to have to be dealing with that fact, right? Okay, so the objectives or questions that I'm going to try and tackle here in this presentation are characterizing landscape patterns, vegetation in post-fire, in these post-fire areas. We have these 12 different burns that we've been playing with. So the first half of the talk, I'll be talking about all 12 of them. Then I'm going to flip over to just these southwestern burns for like the last maybe 5 minutes. And what's happening? We have a fire, the forest changes. Do we get a forest again, or do we get something else? And specifically, we're looking at it through the lens of this thing that we're calling fire refugia, which I'll define in a minute. How much forest persists through these fires? How well do these refugia actually support resilience or forest recovery? And then when you don't have forest coming back, what do you end up with? All right. So the definition of fire refugia. And this is the talk that I'm smashing on top of the talk that I was planning on giving. But I think it's pretty interesting to think about. So we define, the refugia are defined as habitats that components of biodiversity retreat to, persist in, and can potentially expand from under changing environmental conditions. So there's a lot of interest in refugia right now because environmental conditions are changing. Fire refugia, we're calling places that burn less frequently or severely than the surrounding landscape. So they're refugia from a particular kind of disturbance. And these are the places we would think would harbor those disturbance-sensitive species, or those old-growth forest attributes in a changing landscape. And sort of operationally, well, the way we've defined them for sort of research purposes is just where you have a patch of forest that survived during a fire, right? So this is typically how burns get mapped. Are you guys familiar with like MTBS and data sets and burn severity, Landsat-derived burn severity metrics? And then these classifications, we think about unburned, low, and moderate, and high. So here's in one of our example fires. This is the Pumpkin Fire. I wonder if it's because it kind of has like a jack-o'-lantern. I don't know. Anyways, from Arizona in 2000, this is kind of the standard way of mapping a burn. Let's look at change using these different wavelengths that Landsat can detect and see how much they changed. And then we end up with these categories. But two problems with this are it's really low resolution, 30-meter resolution. And it's hard to interpret these severity classes. Like, OK, high severity, what does that look like? I'm imagining there's no more forest. Low severity, OK, maybe that's forest still. And then what about all this other stuff? So we went to this, we developed our own mapping approach just using 1-meter NAPE imagery and then just this binary classification, like, is it a forest or not? So this is a very forest-centric point of view that we're coming from here, but that's what we're interested in. So, and people care, we like trees, right? Usually, how many of you guys are like forestry students? So, all right. Okay, so this is what we did. So you can see it's different. So if we go back here real quick, burn severity, okay, I don't even know what that means. It's like red, and stop, go, slow down. And then, okay, well, it's either it's a forest or it's not. It turns out 51% of this burn was still forested. We did this for all sorts of burns, and we have a paper that's going through a really lengthy and horrible review process right now. And basically what we learned was, hey, actually, most burn interiors contain a substantial proportion of forest. Somewhere between 20 and 50% of the burns we looked at. Hayman is the worst. It has the least remaining forest of any of our burns that we looked at. And even in areas that were classified as high severity, we still had about 5% of those 1-meter pixels contain trees, or trees that survived the fire. But the median patch size was 56 square meters, so way too small to see in a 900 square meter Landsat pixel. And that means half the patches are even smaller than that. So this means there are lots of refugia that are really small that are out in these landscapes. So we want to know how those things operate. How well do they contribute to what happens next and your potential for forest recovery? So we know that distance to seed source is an important predictor of tree regeneration. It's probably a really useful metric. So it's great for a land manager to be able to say, well, if you're within 150 meters of a seed source, you might have regeneration. And if you're farther than that, we should replant. But some seed sources are bigger. Some patches are really good. And any location on the landscape could probably receive seeds from all sorts of different parts of that landscape. So it might be 150 meters from one tree. That's different than being 150 meters from 18 giant patches of trees, right? So we came up with this metric, and if you like math, you can try and translate that to yourself. But basically, we're just looking at all the different pixels nearby this focal pixel, and then sort of weighting them by how far away they are, and trying to create this more synthetic metric that predicts, that might be useful for predicting the availability of seeds at any given site. So over here, this is our distance weighted density metric. In is inside of our refugia, and then out is outside of the refugia. And as this number decreases, we're getting into areas that have fewer refugia, or they're farther from refugia, or both, right? So the trends here are, if you're ponderosa pine, as there's fewer refugia and you're farther away from them, you get fewer ponderosa pine seedlings. Same thing with this mixed conifer assemblage, which is me just lumping together all the Doug firs and the, what else? We have white firs and just, all the other stuff that is sort of obligate seeding. And then this assemblage is lodgepole pine and aspen. And guess what? They don't really need refugia. They have other way cool adaptations to persist through burns or regenerate following fire. And this is all tree species together. And so just basically, if you want a forest, it's better to have lots of refugia on your landscape. And this is like the classic pattern that we might see. Here's one of our little patches of fire, or forests that survive fire, and sort of this nice ring of baby trees all around it. Okay, so here, this was our next question. What's best? Lots of small patches, a couple large patches, or something in between? Like, if you wanted to have forest recovery, what's like the best configuration in your post-fire landscape? And we really do see like this really large variation in how these things were arranged. And so to do this, we developed some statistical models, which I'm not going to go into at all, but they're negative binomial generalized linear mixed effects models. And I really recommend the super cool package GLM-MTMB if you like that kind of stuff. Anyways, developed some statistical models using our different predictor variables, generated simulated landscapes, calculated our predicted variables like distance and this weighted density metric for all non-forested pixels. And then at each time step, we used our statistical models to basically what's the distribution of tree seedlings that you would get, and basically calculate how many, we basically reforest these landscapes based on their relationships to these spatial predictors. And then we go in and count all the non-forested pixels. So, this is kind of a workflow. Here's our landscape, artificial landscape. Here's our metrics. And then over time, you can start to see like, hey, look, there's more and more and more baby trees. And those are those lighter colors kind of coming in there. All right. So here's what we found. For the ponderosa pine, mixed conifer, and all tree species assemblages, refugia are awesome. They promote tree regeneration. So the statistical models show that. The simulation model, well, it's based on that statistical model, so it shows it too. But what these graphs show is this is the x-axis is the proportion of the landscape that contained refugia at the start of the model run. And the y-axis is the proportion that we considered recovered over these different time steps. And basically this, so over here is year 1, year 5, year 10, year 20. And these are our patch sizes. If that proportion is occupied by really tiny, lots of tiny refugia, it's dark green, and then it sort of shifts to a light blue if you just have like maybe one giant patch or a couple giant patches. And so basically what you can see here is over time, year 1, 5, 10, 20, we see more and more of the landscape getting recovered. We also see that the more refugia, the more proportion of refugia in your landscape, the better you do. But also that these smaller patches are doing a much better job. They're disproportionately important in recovering landscapes. So that one little lonely tree out there all by itself in the middle of this high severity patch in the pumpkin burn is like the most important tree in the world for recovering this particular landscape. Make sense? All right. So this is what we learned. Okay, refugia confer landscape resilience. And here's my little schematic again. And basically, it's kind of interesting that these areas that had resistance are what gives you resistance elsewhere in the landscape. Here's another weird conceptualization of that. Here's our little pocket of trees. and we can think about this sort of stability landscape where we might have forests or non-forests. The closer you are, the more abundant these patches of trees are. It sort of tilts that stability landscape, and after you lose your forest, but the ball is more likely to roll down into that little forest cup if you have lots of refugia or they're abundant. And then you get farther away, and there's no more influence, and maybe it can go either way. We really don't know. So refugia are good, but not everywhere on the landscape contains refugia. And as all these awesome researchers, and it's really it's awesome to follow these young, rising rock star researchers here. Climate can have a huge impact on this whole process too, right? So as Camille has shown, and as Kim has shown, and as Ellen is showing, hey, there's also this other changing environmental context, right? So this is just moving to those burns from the southwest. We took all the vegetation within those patches and threw them into this multivariate analysis to see what other than forest recovery, what are our options in these landscapes? So this is I'm not really going to go into it, but we basically took all the variation in this vegetation data set and boiled it down into really 3 axes of variation. And you can see this is based on species composition. There's kind of a zone of lots of tree regeneration, a zone of lots of shrub cover, and then lots of grasses and graminoids all over the place, but kind of an area where there's really not a lot of tree regeneration or shrubs, so it's by default grassy. Okay. How do these relate to climate and landscape relationships, or climate and landscape variables? This is a principal component analysis of post-fire mean climate, so not that high-resolution annual stuff that Kim was talking about, but just take, of all the years since fire, what's sort of the average precipitation, average temperature? So this is it's like using a sledgehammer instead of the, surgical tools that Kim was using. But basically what we found was, hey, these contour lines are showing relationships between that ordination space and these different predictors. Here's our density-weighted refugia metric. So big influences or big relationships there. Our warmth index, which is sort of how, it's pretty much what mean annual temperature is, going from cooler to warmer, and then aridity going from less arid to more arid. You can already kind of see, if you remember, the trees are all over on that left, kind of lower left corner, that near seed sources, cooler, wetter sites are the sites where we see more tree regeneration. And then you sort of move out into this area where you're far from seed sources, it's drier and warmer. That's where you might see those other kinds of communities. So this is sort of simplifying this and breaking this vegetation data set into these different communities that maybe we can think of and talk about, other than some random ordination score or something. But these are different types: aspen forests, ponderosa pine regeneration, mixed conifer regeneration. So these are sort of our forest types. Then these 2 shrubby types, a mixed shrub and an oak. A lot of you guys are probably familiar with Gamble's oak. And then sort of this grassy zone where we have native bunch grasses, or what I'm calling ruderal grasses, which is like cheatgrass or other super weedy species. So they kind of fall out into these sort of groupings based on their shared relationships with what species are found with one another. All right. So real quick, I'm just going to show you some pictures. Have you seen aspen forest before? All right. It's kind of cool. This was ponderosa pine, Doug fir forest, and now it's aspen. So there must have been a lot of aspen sort of buried in there. And you can see there's a few trees that are left, and it's completely taken over by aspen. All right. This is what ponderosa pine regeneration looks like. In some places, there's a lot of it, right? It's not the end of the ponderosa pine forest everywhere. This is from the Hayman burn. This is a mixed conifer site. Pretty sparse, and this tended to occur in sort of really the drier end of these higher elevation landscapes. So if it was wet, it turned into aspen. If it was dry, it was kind of sparse mixed conifer, Doug fir, pondo coming back in. And then these really horrible, I don't know if you guys are familiar with New Mexico locust. This is the future. Be a resprouting, nitrogen-fixing, thorny shrub. And you are going to do well for yourselves in the Anthropocene. Hard to get a really nice charismatic photo. There's people in there having to measure stuff. So always looking for field crews. All right. And then oak, these are some of our classic sort of converted from ponderosa pine to oak. Bunch grasses. Hey, there's that lonely tree again. This is basically native grassland that had trees, and now it doesn't have trees anymore. And then this is the really weird stuff. It's like completely reorganized. It's completely different from the forest. It's totally different species, lots of weedy species. And I would argue this is probably the thing that we don't want to see across the landscape. Okay, 2 more slides. Well, maybe a couple more. 2 more informative slides. The next thing we did was, could we predict how abundant these things will be under future climates? So I took the same climate data, the same kinds of climate data, and pulled out 2 different future climate scenarios for 2055. They're both warm, a drier one and a wetter one. And then based on relationships between currently what we see and current or post-fire climate, what might the future hold for some of these burns? Okay, and basically this is what I found. Currently, the models of our sample points predicted, well, about half of them are forest, half of them are non-forest. If you look at so based on those climate relationships, if we project 2055 dry or wet, either way we see less forest recovery, which is great because it's a totally different way of coming at this. Same story comes out of it, right? Scrubby, oaks and locusts, and there's tons of really cool shrubs out there. But here we ended up with about a quarter of our sites scrubby based on our model projections. Under the dry scenario, that really bumps up. We saw a 79% increase. Under the wet scenario, it also bumps up, so 35% increase. And then finally, these grassy trajectories. Currently, it was a smaller fraction of our sites that the model would predict to be grassy. Under the dry scenario, that bumped up by a 37%. Under the wet scenario, it actually declined a little bit. So you could take that with a grain of salt, but it is consistent with very different ways, and really this sort of really mechanistic vapor pressure deficit annual resolution, kind of giving us the same answers, or the same types of answers, that we're likely to be losing the capacity for these systems to recover forests. Okay, so some conclusions. I'm proselytizing fire refugia here, and hopefully you'll think that these things are important as well. But post-fire vegetation can include forest recovery, conversion to alternate forest types. So aspens, hey, it's a different kind of forest, but we still have a lot of the same forest values there. Or completely non-forested types. Well, so for the range folks in here, good news. And I don't know if there's a shrub department at CSU. If you're in the shrub department, shrubbery science, great news. You've got a bright future. Okay, under future climates, we're probably going to see more of those. Okay. 2 just little take-home things. There's a lot of uncertainties, and we're dealing with this zone of here's what we're seeing. Where are we going? We're trying to make some projections, but there are a lot of uncertainties. But I would say what we already know should compel management and conservation responses, because what we're seeing and the projections we have suggest, hey, we're poised to lose quite a bit of our forested systems in the very near future. And that's already what we're seeing in some of these really dramatically altered landscapes. From the boreal all the way down to the Chiricahua Mountains in Arizona, we're seeing the same pattern. So something to think about. Lots of great folks helped out with this stuff. And yeah, I don't know if there's time for questions or not, but I do have a slide that says questions. Offer us your opinion, and you guys, yeah.
What my work suggests, I think, is that those treatments are important for reducing the fire severity, so that we don't see as rapid a conversion by having reduced adult mortality, right? So we're not going to, maybe we will see reduced regeneration, but those adults will provide not only seed sources, but also they can buffer the hot temperatures a little bit, so you might see a little bit more regeneration than you would without them. But ultimately, there are going to be sites that are too hot and too dry that even if it's lower severity, we might not see regeneration.
I completely agree.
Yeah, we have a consensus on that one. I would say that there are there are a lot of values to strategically, restoring historic fire regimes, reducing fuels. I'm sort of advocating for thinking about treatments that might lead to or promote refugia following fire. Maybe some opportunities to replant in ways that sort of mimic that pattern as well. But I would say it would be important to be, it's a triage situation that we live in, and where we do those treatments, we really need to be very aware of the best science that we have tells us some of these areas it's a waste of time because this is not going to be suitable for trees. But there's a lot of uncertainties. Maybe somebody just really wants to save those trees and they're going to gamble on it. Great, maybe, right?
Yeah, there's lots of areas where we can still have trees coming back, so it is still important to do management.
All right. Others. We came all the way out here. We presented all this information.
Presented too well.
So, Jonathan, this question's for you. And I was thinking, you talked at this a little bit, but maybe you could speak to it a bit more, is what are the sort of physiographic factors that make a given location a refuge?
Yeah, well, that is a great question. And we've explored that quite a bit, but there's probably a lot more work we can do to try and get at that. In some settings, there are clear topographic predictors, and so and I would say I would call them like static topographic predictors, like anything that serves as a natural fuel break, or ridges where a fire might run up one side and then never be able to go back down the other side. A river, places that have cooler, more mesic conditions because of the topography, places that are above a cliff band, things like that. But also, there are I would say, the sort of dynamic, but also deterministic, like vegetation types, or, so this is where I think there's opportunities for managers. Like, if managers put in a fuel break, it can have the same effect as if it were, a cliff, right? So historical factors that influence vegetation pattern on the landscape, and our colleague Sean Parks has done a lot of work showing that, an old fire scar can, when a fire runs into that old fire scar, it can simmer down and drop to the ground, and then trees that are left in there are much more likely to, not be cooked in a crown fire. But also there's a lot of stochastic factors and fire behavior and nuances. There's a lot of luck too. And the ratio that we can predict these things versus it's just luck depends on fire, the conditions that fire is burning under, what the topography is. So I think I would say that's a really rich area to really dive in and try and understand more, for sure.
Once you get recruitment of new trees, like in that first year, is that indicative of an area that probably can return to a forest, or is there a certain number of years that they need to make it before you can determine whether or not the forest can recover in that area?
You can go.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a positive sign, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee anything, because once your seedling is established, it's still really vulnerable to those altered conditions that Kim was talking about, so the more extreme surface temperatures, for example. So even though your seedling might establish, and you might have pretty good establishment in the first year, immediately after fire, if you have then a drought really severely, or really hot conditions, 3 years after fire, it's possible, especially in northern ecosystems, that you've missed your window, kind of. So where there's seed sources from refugia in obligate cedars, I think you're kind of optimistic that probably the site conditions are good and it may recur. But in some of these other ecosystems that have serodini and in situ seed sources, just because there is establishment, it's not a guaranteed win. But I think it's a positive sign. Would you guys agree?
Yeah, I think seedlings are the most sensitive to climate the first year. They're definitely still sensitive in the second year, but declines over time. But you could get a drought when they're 2 or 3 years old, and that could still kill them. But really making through that first year is definitely like the biggest step to cross, I would say.
Yeah, and then what happens next is also important in terms of, do you have another fire, right? And that's what Ellen was talking about. And, you know, hey, great, we got all these seedlings, and then it burned again, but while we also had all these heavy fuels from the first fire produced, and then you can really cook your landscapes. And so, you know, that's where that's another place where there's opportunities for maybe dialing in management. Maybe you want to get rid of some of those heavy fuels with a prescribed fire in October rather than have something roll through in July and evaporate, you know, turn those things into white ash and get rid of all the tree regeneration that you had, you know, just been so happy to have seen, or something like that.
If I'm a manager and I have limited resources, do you think I should focus more efforts on the areas that haven't burned and making them more resistant to these kind of changes? Or should I be doing work in those places to make them more better functioning future ecosystems?
I'm gonna guess more of your landscape is unburned than burned, so you might want to focus your attention there, but no. It probably just
Yeah.
depends on the values, right? Like if your burned area is a very special place to people, you deal with it anyway. But Kim, sorry.
No, I mean, yeah, I don't know. And I mean, it also depends on the probability of reburning. I mean, if you're managing a forest that is going to reburn a lot, like, and this has been happening in California recently, where they've done a lot of plantations and then it reburns, maybe, yeah, that's a factor to think about. Maybe it's better to try and get a lower severity fire by fuels treatments in the unburned areas to begin with. I don't know. Do you have thoughts?
I mean, the reality is obviously managers are focusing on where there's still trees on the landscape, and oftentimes sort of writing off these you know, these crazy cooked areas. So maybe to go back to Gloria's point, if it was a perfect world, or if there, you know, if we could have more management, and then I would say there are a lot of opportunities to be thinking about how we manage some of these areas. And obviously you're thinking about this too.
Yeah, maybe you should.
Yeah, right. Wait a second. What do you think, Camille?
No.
Okay.
I hear what you guys thought.
Yeah. I would say right now the focus is on saving the forests that are out there, and that's not a bad focus, but I wouldn't mind seeing some of the, let's put it this way, some of our fuels treatments and some of the things we're doing to save those forests is also a waste of time and resources and money, and maybe we could even be a little more strategic and say, actually this one area, this rhodiochetus burned, super crazy burn, but now we've got the conditions that are ripe for a huge reburn, and we've got loads of regen and tons of heavy fuel out there. Hey, you know, that might be a place to have a future forest. Whereas somewhere else you might know, yeah, the chances of having a forest here are fairly slim. So maybe that's where the sort of climate kind of niche modeling stuff could help guide us a little bit too.
Yeah, I think that's,
All right.
yeah.